Liverpool didn't just lose 2-0 to PSG. They were outplayed, outpositioned, and tactically exposed. And if this isn't fixed, the second leg is already gone. Let me show you exactly why. This is where the game is lost. McAllister, Gravenberch, look at that distance. PSG didn't break the lines. We opened them. This isn't pressure. This is space being given away. Right from kickoff, the midfield looked completely disconnected. And Liverpool's double pivot is usually the heartbeat of the team. And that was being bypassed at will. Vitinha and Neves had time, they had space and freedom to dictate the tempo. And there was zero pressure, zero compactness. And when Liverpool tried to press, it was fragmented. One player goes forward, the other two lag behind, and the gap in the middle wasn't just dangerous. It really invited PSG to operate with clarity and with precision. The transition from the defense to attack failed completely. And every time the ball was lost, Liverpool's midfield wasn't in a position to recover. PSG could instantly exploit the space between the lines. Even when Szoboszlai dropped deeper to pick up the ball, the midfield wasn't connecting. There was no link, no pivot, no outlet. And this is exactly where tactical discipline must come in. Without midfield cohesion, the defense gets exposed and attacks get blocked and the team loses that rhythm. And Arne Slot has to identify this and adjust the positioning, the pressing triggers and the support angles. Otherwise, the second leg could be a complete nightmare. Now, moving on to point two, we have wide isolation, and this is where Kvaratskhelia absolutely tormented Liverpool. On the left flank, he was almost untouchable. Kvaratskhelia thrives in tight spaces like that, and he loves to drift inwards from wide positions, and then he pulls defenders out of shape, and he creates pockets of space for his teammates. And what's remarkable is that even when he received limited support, sometimes isolated out there on that wing, he could still drive the attack forward with dribbles or sharp turns and that explosive pace. And that kind of isolation forces the defensive line to make a choice. Either leave him alone or risk him cutting inside or overcommit and leave gaps elsewhere. And PSG exploited that beautifully. Now, Liverpool's fullbacks were stretched, the midfielders were dragged out of position, and the entire defensive structure became fragile. And Kvaratskhelia, his movement not only created chances for himself, but it really destabilized the entire shape, and it led directly to the goal threats and ultimately the two-goal deficit that Liverpool now faces in the return leg. The takeaway for me from that is when a player of Kvaratskhelia quality is isolated but still dominant, it exposes the team's defensive weakness in ways that are incredibly hard to recover from without tactical adjustments. Now, let's for a second move to defensive transitions, which is where Liverpool really struggled in this game. And defensive transitions, of course, are all about moments immediately after losing possessions and how quickly you react, how your shape resets, and how you prevent the opposition from exploiting the spaces. So here, PSG were lightning fast in these moments. The second Liverpool lost the ball, PSG's forwards and their wingers applied immediate pressure, and it forced these hurried passes and created numerical superiority in critical areas. And this is where the gap between the midfield and the defense became glaring. Liverpool's players were slow to compact, and the pressing lines were just left open, just gaping there. And Arne Slot's team really struggled to recover in time, and meaning that each turnover almost instantly turned into a dangerous chance for PSG. The lack of urgency and organization in these defensive transitions directly contributed to the goals conceded, and it shows why mastering this phase of the game is non-negotiable for any team aiming for Champions League success. And moving on to the fullback overload, This was another major issue for Liverpool. PSG exploited the wide areas relentlessly, and whenever Liverpool's fullbacks pushed on high, PSG's wingers and their midfielders created 2v1 or even 3v2 situations on the flanks. And this forced Liverpool into uncomfortable choices. Either leave the centre backs exposed or allow dangerous crosses into the box. And the overload wasn't just about the numbers, it was about the timing as well. PSG attacked precisely when Liverpool's defensive line was stretched, isolating the fullbacks and creating gaps between the midfield and the defense. This tactical nuance really shows the difference between a well-drilled defensive setup and one that's slightly disjointed under pressure. For Liverpool, closing these gaps requires coordination of some sorts, and it requires the cross, the back four, and the mid. And without that, teams like PSG, who are technically gifted and quick in transitions, they can repeatedly exploit the wide channels and punish the defensive mistakes. And watching these overloads unfold, you can see how quickly a small positional error can cascade into a goal-scoring opportunity. Now, for a second, let's talk about the central compactness and the pressing gaps. And this is where Liverpool's structure really faltered, Well, in theory, the midfield and defensive lines should compress together to deny space in the central channels. But yesterday, PSG consistently found pockets between the lines. When Liverpool's midfield pushed forward, the central defenders were left too exposed, and that created these gaps that were immediately exploited. It wasn't just about PSG moving the ball quickly, it was about Liverpool's timing being slightly off. The pressing triggers weren't synchronized, and it left just enough room for Kvaratskhelia or Dembele to receive and turn. And what you notice is a domino effect. One misstep in compactness leads to another. The gap between the defensive line and the midfield, that becomes a corridor for attacks. And PSG punished every lapse. This isn't about individual errors. It's about the team needing to be sharper in maintaining that central compactness and synchronized pressing to prevent these dangerous situations. Now, moving on to transition vulnerabilities and the counter patterns, this is where the game's momentum really shifted against Liverpool. Every time possession was lost, the team struggled to regroup defensively. PSG exploited those moments as well, and with quick vertical passes, catching the midfield and the defense in uncoordinated positions. And what you notice is that the spacing and stagger between the lines weren't consistent at all. The counters weren't just fast, they were surgical. Some of the players thrived in transition moments, and it really exploited hesitation of defenders and the space between the midfield and the back line. Even when Liverpool tried to press immediately, the pressing triggers were so poorly timed, leaving gaps that PSG's forwards could also exploit effortlessly. Essentially, Liverpool's transition play created a series of domino effects. One misstep in position, one slow reaction, and suddenly PSG had a clear path through the middle or out wide. Now, fixing this isn't just about chasing the ball. It's about understanding the patterns, anticipating the threats, and keeping the compactness during moments of defensive transition. Now, I want to pivot over and I want to focus on the fullback exposure and the wide overloads, which was a key vulnerability against PSG. So Liverpool's fullbacks, in trying to provide width in the attack, often push up high, like we've said, and it left large gaps behind them. PSG exploited that as well, with quick switches of plays and overlapping runs, creating that numerical superiority on the flanks. And once again, Kvaratskhelia, again, was a prime example, frequently isolating himself against one-on-one situations and stretching the back line. With minimal support from his midfielders, Liverpool's wide areas became dangerous zones for counter-attacks. And this also forced the centre backs into wide positions and really disrupting defensive compactness and making it easier for PSG to cut through the middle. What stands out for me is that Liverpool's defensive shape wasn't adaptive enough. And when the ball was lost high on the pitch, recovery runs were delayed, leaving those fullbacks exposed, and it created these predictable patterns for PSG to attack repeatedly. And fixing this requires tighter coordination between all of our players in the central of the park, while we still got to be providing that attacking width. Another observation is that in the PSG match, Liverpool centre-backs were often pulled out of position due to wide overloads. Doué's movement created gaps between the centre-back and the full-backs, right? Which PSG again exploited with quick vertical passes or diagonal balls into the channels. So the defensive line also struggled with these pressure triggers. Players were slow to step up or compress the space when possession was lost, leaving dangerous pockets for the opposition to exploit. Midfielders were not consistently tracking runners or providing cover, increasing the exposure of central defenders. The key takeaways for me here are awareness of the positioning. The centre backs must maintain compactness and anticipate the wide isolations. Midfielders and the fullbacks need clear triggers for pressing to avoid leaving central areas vulnerable. And the other thing is a constant verbal and visual cues are required to shift the cover as a cohesive unit. Improving these areas can reduce the vulnerability to through balls or cutbacks or overloads in critical zones. Liverpool's midfield during transitions, particularly how gaps were created when possession was lost or recovered, is another thing. Here are some of the key observations I've noted. Liverpool's midfielders sometimes delayed pressing after losing the ball, and that just gave PSG space to build attacks. The timing of the pressing was so inconsistent, especially when PSG exploited vertical channels. That needs to be watched. When midfielders are bypassed with quick passes or there were large voids in the central areas, it really forced defenders to cover extra ground, and often it breaks that defensive line. And then the lack of coordinated rotation between the holding midfielder and the central pair created misalignments, and it left both flanks and the central zones exposed. So my recommendations would be midfielders need to be quicker in recognizing of these triggers for pressing and tighter rotations to maintain that compactness. Supporting the runners and the defensive coverage must be synchronized to avoid leaving the defense isolated. Now, mastering these transitional moments is crucial to preventing counter-attacks and maintaining team shape. When you look at Liverpool's attacking issues and why their build-up was often ineffective especially in recent matches, you find some of the following. The team struggled to move the ball through the midfield when they are under pressure. They often rely on these long passes or these isolated dribbles, which allowed opponents to recover quickly. Without coordinated movements or quick combinations, attackers are easily contained, and this reduces the penetration and limited high-quality chances. The fullbacks or the wide midfielders were either too deep or too static, which minimized the space for overlapping runs and for central congestion. Another thing is the counter-attacks were slowed by indecision or poor positioning, giving the opposition time to recognize this defensively. So my recommendation is improve quickly, short passing sequences in tight spaces, use dynamic rotations to create gaps, and ensure wide support from the fullbacks and the wingers to stretch the defense. Addressing these attacking inefficiencies, they're critical to converting possession into meaningful scoring opportunities, and of course also to reducing reliance on individual brilliance only. And a critical factor in Liverpool's recent struggles has been late substitutions, and key players being left out like Salah, Gamoa, and Chiesa, we often talk about. And these decisions contributed to, I think, the frustration that we felt and arguably affected the team's performance. They had this delayed impact, and making substitutions too late, it limits the ability to influence the game, especially when you're chasing a scoreline. You've got unused firepower sitting there, leaving high quality attackers like Salah and Ngamoa on the bench. It removes options for immediate offensive impact and it reduces the unpredictability for the opposition. And it also has a psychological effect because these late changes can signal a lack of urgency or tactical inflexibility, which could dampen the team's morale on the pitch. And it's missed tactical adjustments. Early substitutions can really exploit the defenders, create overloads, shift the momentum, or even, it can change how we do things in time. In short, these late reactions and not deploying attacking talent limited Liverpool's ability to turn possession into goals and maintain the pressure. And it adds to the frustration for a lot of fans and I think for the players alike. Okay, so this is quite a lot to take in from this game. The late substitutions, the missed opportunities to bring Salah, Gamoa, and Chiesa on. That left us, I think, very frustrated and ultimately out of rhythm. So Liverpool showed glimpses, but these decisions and the timing, I think that cost us momentum. Now, I want to hear from you. What changes would you have made? And do you agree with the late subs or would you have acted differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit a like button if you enjoyed this breakdown. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next tactical deep dive. Next, we're going to be looking at how Liverpool can turn these lessons into actions in the upcoming match. So, stay tuned.